See how it sort of curled down like that? That's frost, baby. Right? But the kale can take it. The spinach next to it, that can take the frost. And these greens over here, it's kind of like a Swiss chard, but not exactly. Hey, it's Greg here with MaritimeGardening.com, and I thought I'd do a video today talking about these planting dates that people talk about. Victoria Day weekend is a date. I guess that was last weekend that we use in Canada. It's basically late May, or mid to late May, I suppose, depending on the year. Another indication people use is the first new moon in June. Like, that's some sort of magical date when you should put a garden in. I mean, I start putting my garden in as soon as I can get soil thawed out, because there's some things that are tough and can take the frost. I'm looking around my garden right now. Everything's covered in frost. And all the things that are growing in the garden right now can take it. Right? Let's have a little look. Alright, so here's some kale. And see how it sort of curled down like that? That's frost, baby. Right? But the kale can take it. The spinach next to it, that can take the frost. And these greens over here, it's kind of like a Swiss chard, but not exactly. Sorrel, I guess. A salad green. They can take it. Of course, garlic can take it. Over here, I got carrots, right? And they're growing. I mean, sure, I had a cover on there, but they can take the frost. They can take it. They're tiny. They're really small, but no big deal. And this is not airtight, right? This is just a little thing I put on here to speed some of the carrots up, get them growing a little faster. There's some lettuce over here, right? I gotta, respace everything here, but anyway, lettuce can take it. More greens over here, they can take it. More greens over here, they can take it. I got some tiny little parsnips growing here. They can take it. Look at the frost on that. They'll be fine. Totally fine. Right, there's all kinds of those. Look at the peas over here. Right, planted these in like end of March. And they're growing. Right? They're all growing. Some of them just came up and some of them are up for weeks and weeks. Right? They can take it. More parsnips over here. They can take it. Right, there's all kinds of things you can grow that can take it. Maybe a hard freeze they can't, but a frost. Look, here's some broccoli, right? They can take it. Cauliflower, they can take it. Over here, got some beets. They can take it, right? So, got some collard greens over there. They're growing. I have a little cover on them, but that's just to speed things up. Got some Swiss chard here. I didn't even have I had this vented yesterday, so it's not definitely, whatever zero temp it got to last night, that was zero in here. It doesn't have frost on it, but anyway, that Swiss chard looks great. Alright, so there's all kinds of things you can plant long before that first new moon in June that can handle being cold. Also, a lot of the heat-loving things, your peppers, your tomatoes, your squash, your beans, it is unwise to plant those out before that date, depending on where you live. There's some places where it's, if you live in Texas, you don't care about the first new moon in June. You better have your garden in long before that. Right? So again, it's one of these rules that works for certain parts of the world. But the heat-loving things, you can plant them before the first new moon in June, if you live like where I do in Nova Scotia, Canada, or a northern place that's not too far north, under something like this, right? So I'm going to make a separate video on this, but I'm planting cucumbers right now, even though it's the ground's covered in frost, and everything is covered in frost, and it would probably be a bit risky to plant anything in that family, squash, cucumber, zucchini, that sort of stuff. But under a dome like this, 9 times out of 10 it's okay. I can't say 100% of the time, because you never know what's going to happen. There was one year in June where we had a freeze. I mean, like a hard freeze. And I had tomatoes that had been growing. They were about 6 inches higher than one of these. and they just disappeared overnight. They were vaporized by the cold. That's a risk you take, right? But you know, the other 9 years, you know, you got great tomatoes outside, right? So yeah, you know, I tend to time things. People always ask me, I'm in zone this, I'm in zone that. When should I do this? When should I do that? I don't know. You know, like, your zone doesn't really mean much. Your zone, and I've said this over and over again in videos, your zone is about how cold it gets in winter where you live. You know, how cold it can potentially get. Your minimum temperature, basically the coldest day, right? It speaks to the survivability of perennials. Okay, so if you're in zone 5, I don't know if it's okay to plant tomatoes out where you are. Is it really hot? Right? If you're in zone 4, my mother, she just moved back to Nova Scotia, but she lived in Edmonton for years. And Edmonton's way colder than here. I mean, she's in zone 3 growing zone. I'm in zone 6. And her tomatoes would always be ready ahead of mine, ahead of anyone's here. Right? You just buy a transplant at a garden center, stick it in a pot, put it on our deck. Because even though they have a much colder winter, it can get in the minus 30s, right? Celsius, freezing, minus 35, stuff like that, right? But during the summer, they get sun almost 24 hours a day, right? So it's just a different sort of situation. So stop focusing on your zone. It doesn't really matter. Look around you. Look what's happening in nature. How high are your tulips? How high are your garlic? Things like dandelions, you know, are they growing? You know, is the greenery there? Is the flowers there? Stuff like that. That's what I tend to base my decisions on. Yeah, over time, it's been my experience. I mean, there's a lot of there's a field called an area of inquiry called phenology, which is, you know, studying indications of nature that tell you about seasonal change. That's oversimplification, but that's basically it. So you look to when this bud's opening on that tree, when this bird shows up, when the spring peepers start peeping, all these different little indications. Things happening in the natural world that are indication of the moving of the season, right? Things that only happen in spring, and it's truly spring when that sort of thing happens. So I mean, you know, the spring equinox is late March, but for me, spring from a growing point of view is when I start hearing spring peepers, right, and tiny little amphibian, little frog, they start mating. You know, that's a sign of something, right? When you know, I start seeing certain weeds that grow around the yard, perennials, things that are stuck in the ground. When the ground's warm enough for the roots of that plant to start moving fluids around and start growing, you know, something's happening, right? And that tells me what's going on right here where I am. And, you know, I think there's a lot to be learned from just watching a dandelion. I find that when the dandelion greens start showing up, it means the soil's probably thawed enough for things to germinate that have a really low minimum germination temperature, like spinach, right? Things that can take being, I mean, sure, when the dandelion greens just begin, you're still going to get freezing and thawing and freezing and thawing. So you can only have things planted out that can handle that, like some of the things I showed you this morning. And to varying degrees, some of these are better. Like I find spinach and lettuce much tougher than kale, and even more tougher than Swiss chard, despite its people seem to think that's the toughest thing in the world. It's not. Spinach and lettuce are tougher than Swiss chard. Anyway, for me, if you're thinking about when should the heat-loving plants be out, maybe 4 weeks after you see your first dandelion flower is probably a safe, which is roughly around when the first new moon in June is, right? But instead of tying it to some celestial thing, you're tying it to, you know, how perennial plants, dandelion's not exactly a perennial, but you know, kind of anyway, you know, a plant that's in the ground, how a plant like that that's already established and so on, it's responding to the change in season. Here you got a thing that's adapted for millennia, right, to not begin to grow too soon, right? It wouldn't be effective at passing on its genetic material from year to year if he was doing everything too soon, right? So it's a good indication. And there's lots of lists about forsythias and this thing and that thing, all these different exotic different bushes and flowers and stuff like that. I don't find they're particularly useful because not everyone has those on their property. And what are you going to go plant forsythias to know when to do this or that or the other thing? But pretty much everyone's got dandelions, at least around here where I live, right? It's a pretty common weed. And so when I see the dandelion greens start to show up, I know the ground's warm enough for seeds and plants that can handle cold. You know, they have a very low minimum temperature and they can survive frost. Once I see that flower showing up, I know that I can start planting potatoes in the ground and stuff like that. And I can start planting heat-loving things under domes like this, but it's a bit risky. 2 weeks, as a general rule, after I see those dandelion flowers show up, that is when I start planting all my heat-loving things. And I direct seed everything, and I've got videos on that. I'll put a link to one of them after that, because it's a whole video to explain why I do it that way as opposed to doing transplants. I don't start any transplants indoors. I direct seed everything outdoors, despite having a short growing season. Look, we got frost here, right? We have a short growing season. I know I'm in zone 6A. That doesn't, again, it doesn't mean anything about your growing season. It talks about how cold it gets in the winter. You know, a place like Toronto, Canada, is zone 5, so it's colder than here, but they have a way hotter summer, insanely hot compared to here, and more sun as opposed to being overcast. I mean, it's a beautiful, bright sun, blue sky day today, but so, you know, don't listen to that, right? It's more about what's going on where you are and how your, you know, the ecology where you are. Learn to understand the ecology of where your garden is, and observe the different wild things. When does the grass start growing? When does this weed start growing? When does that bud open up on that tree? Those are the signs that are important. And if you want to make it really simple, you can just base it all on the dandelion. When you see the dandelion greens, you can plant, you know, cold tolerant things. A cold tolerant plant, any plant where you look at the seed pack, right, and it says, you know, plant as soon as the soil can be worked, right? That's a cold loving plant. It's a plant that can take frost, can take being frozen and stuff like that. Will it grow better if it's warm? Of course. So when you start seeing the dandelion greens, you can plant your kale, you can plant your radishes, you can plant your lettuce, and they'll germinate very slowly. If you want to be clever, you plant them at that time of year under plastic, or even a few weeks ahead of that, really, and they'll start to grow. Once you start seeing the dandelion flowers, you can plant your potatoes and some tubers and stuff like that. And the reason that's a good indication for potatoes is once you see the dandelion flowers, you're still going to get frost after that date, for a few weeks anyway, at least. But the potato foliage won't be above the ground. Right? You stick the potato in the ground, you're going to cover it with some stuff. I cover it with a lot of mulch. So it's going to be protected from frosts and cold night. I mean, we had a cold night last night. So when the dandelion flower shows up, you're still getting frost, but you're probably not getting hard freezes anymore, and the soil's probably not freezing, right? That's why it's a good indication for planting potatoes, because the soil's not going to freeze. The potato's in the ground. It's putting out roots and stuff like that, but it's still going to wait a week or so before the eyes start coming up. And once the eyes start sending the foliage above ground, that foliage is vulnerable to frost and can be damaged. It probably won't kill the potato, but it'll set it back to have its foliage damaged by frost. So you plant the potato when you see the dandelion flower, because a couple weeks after that, it's much lower risk of frost. And so for me, if you got one of these things protecting your garden, you can also plant out your heat-loving things under some sort of microclimate. I got some corn planted, I got a bunch of different things planted right now. I'm trying to get that all done right now, because I know that it's going to be at least a week before those seeds germinate, right? And then for another week, a lot of plants I've noticed, when they're really tiny, they're a bit more cold resistant than when they're big. If you have a tomato and it's just put out its first 2 leaves, right? You know, it's a lot of plants, the first 2 leaves look different than the leaves that come after. Usually the first 2 leaves, it's hard to tell what the plant is. And then the next leaves and the next leaf, they have the shape of that plant. The tomato, the second set of leaves, look like tomato leaves. I think it's very possible, I haven't done any research on this at all, but I think it's very possible that those first 2 leaves for a lot of these plants are a little bit tougher and a little bit more cold resistant than the leaves that come after that. And that would make sense, right? You could see a lot of different plant species having, an extra week. Sure, they're heat-loving plants, but maybe they've evolved over time to, get that extra week of insurance from being killed off by frost. Anyway, to sum up, right? When to plant things out, don't base it on a calendar date. Even the last frost date for where I live, I'm near Halifax, so the only last frost date I can get is for Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. It's usually, what the calendar says the last frost date is for here, is usually 3 weeks earlier than the actual last frost date. So if I use that calendar date as a guide, I'd be wrong every damn time, right? Whereas I find the dandelion is pretty reliable, right? The dandelion flower shows up 2 or 3 weeks before the last frost, most of the time. Pretty reliable. So yeah, a little bit of a rambling video there. I didn't mean to go on about that, but I came out here to plant these cucumbers, and then I thought, I wonder how many people are direct seeding their cucumbers right now. Probably just me. And I'm going to do a video on planting these. I'm going to talk about that separately, I think. I came out to shoot a video on that, but I got on this tangent. But anyway, I think there's some tidbits there and a little bit of some insights that you might find interesting. So if you did, please like, share, subscribe. Check out my podcast, maritimegardening.com. And until next time, get out there, get at it, have fun in your garden. Thanks for watching.